Okay. So today we're going to have the third session of the seminar, Building Bridges Between Philosophy and Neuroscience. And the topic of today is going to be memory in the courtroom. So we have two speakers, one coming from cognitive psychology, Deryn Strange, who is a professor working at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in the United States. And she works on memory distortion and the impact of memory distortion. And Katherine Puddifoot, who works at Durham University. She's a professor in philosophy, and she works across philosophy of psychology and social epistemology. So, Francisco, do you want to say some words about the way we organize in general the session?
Well, the seminar is organized in two talks from the speakers, and we tend to limit the talks to 30 minutes, but of course you can extend a bit more. Then we have 10 minutes or less for specific questions for that talk, and then it comes the other speaker, 10 minutes of specific talks. And then we open the question for a more open debate between both two and the people here in the room too. So which one would like to start the talk? Okay, there. Okay.
I'm happy for whoever wants to go first, but if it's me, it's fine.
Please mute.
Yeah, sorry. Maybe if only the speaker can have the sound activated and the other people can just deactivate the sound. I will just mute them, because if not... So Deryn, are you going to start the presentation?
Yes, I'm happy to. Let me just share my screen and then I'll get going.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just trying to, it's in the way. Okay, there we go. Hopefully that's all set and everyone can see my slides and me waving up in the corner. My name is Deryn Strange. As was mentioned, I'm a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And memory is a feature of almost all criminal trials, but it's a particular kind of trial that I'll be talking about in my talk here.
Sorry, Deryn, I think it doesn't fit on the screen. We can't see it correctly. Just we see, no, I don't know the other people, but I can only see one part of the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay, sorry, give me 1 second and I'll reset it. I was trying to be fancy and have my notes at the same time. That's clearly not going to work.
Maybe with less zoom.
No, it's fine. I will just share the whole thing once I have got it sorted. Wrong one again. Excuse me.
No problem.
No problem.
Okay, this time. Okay, so here's where I was. My research program is driven by a fascination I have with memory. That is how it is that we have this system that can allow us to remember with amazing detail episodes of our lives that happened 40, 50 years ago, can at the same time allow us to remember events that actually never happened, or at the very least didn't happen the way we think that they did. So what I wanted to talk about today is how it is that I go about applying the research that I and other colleagues in my area have done to cases in the courtroom. And to really answer that question, I need to go back a little bit to the birth of the court cases where historical memories were the only evidence presented in a criminal trial.
Sorry, Deryn, sorry to interrupt you, but I can't see your screen. So I think
at all?
No, it says Deryn Strange started to share the screen, but it doesn't appear. So I don't know if you...
Oh, it says I'm sharing.
Yes.
You can't see anything?
No, nothing.
Well, that is quite a shame. Let me see if I can figure out what's going on.
Yes, no problem.
Saco las cosas de acá, me voy para el comedor.
Sorry.
Okay, what can you see now?
No.
Oh, okay, I don't know what to say about that then. Maybe I just do it without my slides.
Okay, if you want to try a little more, and if not, as you wish.
Or you could try as before with less Zoom, maybe.
I'd taken the Zoom off, so it shouldn't have been, shouldn't be an issue at all. I'll try one more time.
Okay.
Anything?
Yes, perfect.
You can? Okay,
Yes.
I have no idea what happened there because I did exactly the same thing. But
Okay.
moving on. Okay, so this is where I was saying that to answer the question that I posed, I need to go back to the birth of these court cases where historical memories were the only evidence that was being presented in support of the supposed crime. And that happened in November of 1989 when Eileen Franklin Lipsker accused her father of raping and murdering her childhood best friend, Susan Nason. Now, sadly, there's nothing that unusual about a child accusing her father of a crime, but here the crime had occurred 20 years earlier. Susan's body had been found in a clearing outside the village where the girls grew up. There was huge media interest in the case because crimes didn't happen in that neighborhood, and a culprit was never caught, so the case was left unsolved. We fast forward 20 years, and now we have Eileen going to two detectives and saying that she had repressed these memories and had recently recovered them through the help of therapy. That therapy had involved hypnosis and excessive guided imagery. And although she now had these memories, every detail that she was able to provide had been in the media at the time of the actual crime. So she actually did not present any new information. Regardless, the case went to trial. And it was in the media every night. It was an enormous case. And this was before social media and before the 24-hour news networks. Elizabeth Loftus, the most prominent researcher in this area, was called as an expert witness for the defense, but all she really had to talk about was her misinformation studies, that is, how we can be wrong about details of an event, which frankly was not at all compelling when put up against Eileen's memory of her father raping and murdering her best friend. Unsurprisingly then, Franklin was found guilty and he was sentenced to a life in prison. And literally within days, hundreds of these cases where repression and then recovered memories were the only evidence began to flood the criminal and civil courts across the United States. So what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about these repressed memories? Well, repression is a fundamental tenet of Freud's psychoanalysis, one of the defense mechanisms that he proposed. And in this incantation, the event is banished from consciousness until such a time that it can be dealt with. But even though the person doesn't know this event happened, the emotion associated with that event is left to seep into their relationships, their everyday relationships. Any anxiety or depression is thought to have its root cause in a childhood repressed memory. Over time, only with the help of a therapist, people are able to recall these memories. And when they do, they recall them in pristine condition, as if no forgetting has occurred at all. So to put it very simply, these kinds of memories bear no relationship to anything that we know about memory. So all of the rules about how memory works have to be suspended if you are to accept the validity of repression. And importantly, Freud wasn't clear about what was repressed, when it was repressed, or how it was repressed. And when he met with opposition, because he did, he revised the theory to become more palatable to the audience. So what that means is that even amongst believers in this concept, a coherent definition that's shared across groups can be almost impossible to come by. So when we're back in the 1990s, we see these cases flooding the courts, and the proponents of repression argued that the increase that we were seeing was an increase in reporting of sexual abuse, not an increase in actual crimes. Advocates were arguing that women hadn't been able to remember their abuse because they had repressed it. And this general belief really flooded the media. You can see here, like, just some samples of the biggest actors and Miss America from the period who were covered on the cover of every popular magazine talking about their experiences of recovering memories. They were on talk shows. It was just everywhere. It was the Me Too of its day. It flooded the popular culture. Unsurprisingly then, I guess, by the early 90s, 6,007 families were seeking help from the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, a group that had been established to provide support to people who found themselves accused of horrific acts of historical sexual abuse. So what happened? Well, when the lack of any empirical evidence to support the phenomenon of repression became clear, courts started to not allow these things, this testimony to be admitted. So the cases petered out. Verdicts were overturned, including George Franklin. He was let out, and they declined to retry him when it became clear that Eileen had recovered memories of a boy called Andrew being killed as well by her father, but Andrew happened to still be alive. So she lost a little bit of credibility there. And then therapists started to lose civil cases as well and have to pay an enormous sum of money as a kind of apology for having instilled these false memories. So the combination of these factors meant that the cases of historical claims kind of petered out and disappeared from the court system. So why am I talking about it today then? Well, because it's back, and it's back with a vengeance, you could say. I am called by lawyers and attorneys across the country and from another few countries around the world, actually, to consult and testify in cases where memory is the key issue. I'm often asked to review the discovery or any evidence in the case to determine whether or not there's something that a memory expert could say on the stand that would help educate the jury. So when there is, I am called to, as an expert witness, to educate the jury about the ways in which memory does and doesn't work. So when I say these cases are on the rise, what I mean is that I currently, as in right this very second, have 2 case files that I am reviewing where women have claimed to have repressed their memories of sexual abuse happening to them when they were 4 or 5 years old and are now in their 40s and 50s. And in both of those cases, the women had no memory or knowledge that the abuse had actually occurred until they had been through decades of therapy and started a new therapy that had helped them to uncover fuzzy and evolving memories that supported their claims of abuse. Now, I've also, I should note, testified in at least 20 other cases in the last 5 years where similar terms are being put forward, but not using the word repression. So we often now see traumatic amnesia, dissociative amnesia, or a suppression term being used in place of repression. And my argument and the argument of my colleagues is that these terms are all much of a muchness. They're still problematic, although dissociation can certainly be a genuine response to trauma. The definition has expanded so much in the last several decades that it now includes what we used to call repression. So it's kind of a definition creep. I also note that in recent years, United States have started to eliminate the statutes of limitations that were in place on sex crimes. So it used to be that you only had a certain period of time to report the crime once you became aware of it. But now these statutes have been eliminated. So people do not need a rationale for failing to have come forward in the past. So we also don't see repression being invoked as much anymore. Nonetheless, there is an enormous focus on historical sexual crimes in our culture right now, exacerbated by the Me Too movement. And here I just give you a sampling, and granted it might just be a United States phenomenon, but while I was watching a baseball game, in the space of 30 minutes, these are the advertisements that came on during the ad breaks, where lawyers are, forgive my language, trolling for clients to come forward and tell them about their abuse histories, and being very specific about the fact that if they do, they stand to get financial compensation. So I would argue that that could be seen as a little bit coercive, a little bit. So what do jurors think of these kinds of cases? Well, 81% in one sample believe that we often repress traumatic memories. So you have the majority of the public believing that this is a plausible response to trauma, if not a common response to trauma. The percentage is slightly less when we surveyed a group of professionals, as in psychologists, psychiatrists, and the like, and a lay public comparison group. But still, over the majority of people believed in repression. And an important thing to note is that people do not distinguish between unconscious repression in the Freudian sense and suppression, the more palatable new term that people are actively not thinking about these events. They see them the same and think that they work the same, meaning that when you recover a memory that you have suppressed actively, it should still be as detailed as the time at which you experience that event. Now, I do want to be clear here that I do not think that all historical claims of abuse are problematic. When I review a case file, I have no concerns if it's clear that the abuse was always remembered and only recently reported, or if there is contemporaneous evidence that it happened. So, for example, if a person had written in their diary at the time of the event talking about what had happened to them, then I'm not concerned about these issues in those cases. By contrast, if the abuse was only recently discovered, or it's only been discovered after years, if not decades of therapy, and where there is no corroboration except for the memory report, these are the situations in which I think it's important that the jury hear from a memory expert about the ways that memory can and can't work. So then, what do I say if I'm actually called to testify? Well, there I'd cycle back to how we actually began this type of research in the first place. So if presented with a recovered memory, one plausible explanation is that the event actually happened and that it's genuinely been recovered. And if the person is claiming repression or the like, I would say that there is no empirical evidence to support the idea of repression. Studies that have been conducted typically suffer from fatal flaws that show any evidence of support. But it is, in fact, possible that they forgot the event and have only recently come to remember the event with the right kinds of cues. Alternatively, it's also plausible that the event did not in actual fact happen, and that people have developed a false memory of that event. Now, here is usually where I get asked, how on earth is it possible to develop an entirely false memory of such a horrific thing as sexual abuse? Well, here we had, in the 1990s, therapists were encouraging a great deal of memory work. The therapies were hypnosis, trance work, dream work, rebirthing, that is actively trying to rebirth the person so that they can wipe their memories clean, guided imagery, age regression, past life analysis. The combination of these therapies by themselves and each individual one, we know that they are highly suggestive and not surprisingly lead to false reports of events. Here I would draw your attention to the instruction manual for the guided imagery training. So for example, the instruction to a client would be spend time imagining that you were sexually abused without worrying about accuracy, proving anything, or having your ideas make sense. As you give rein to your imagination, let your intuitions guide your thoughts. There is copious research demonstrating that imagination can result in memories. And here you're actively being encouraged to imagine a scenario. It should be no surprise that people can then come to develop memories of that abuse. And one might argue that in a controlled environment like a therapist's office, that's okay to use those kinds of techniques. And I'm not a believer in that, but it became much more problematic when these techniques were in self-help books that people could go into any bookstore and purchase and work through them in workbooks at home. They were told things like, many women don't have memories, some never get memories. This does not mean that they weren't abused. If you think you were abused and your life shows the symptoms, then you were. And the way you would find out was by looking at a checklist to find what the symptoms were. Excuse me, hiccups now. Anxiety, depression, general phobias, sexual difficulties, a sense of helplessness or failure. I would challenge any person to not tick a couple of those off. They were certainly vague, and there was no guidance on how many positive responses were required for you to know that you were the victim of childhood sexual abuse. In fact, denial of victimhood was one of the symptoms. So if you denied that you were a victim, that was a symptom that you were. Basically, it was nearly impossible not to conclude that you were a victim of incest. Indeed, one famous writer claimed that it was an all-purpose female checklist. And I'd also note here that these kinds of therapies were common. 71% of PhD level US and UK therapists had used at least one questionable technique. 58% had used two or more. A quarter of those sampled were focused on memory recovery, yet almost the entire sample did recognize that it was possible for a client to come to believe they were sexually abused, even though no abuse had occurred. So they're endorsing that possibility, but still using those therapies. So where are we at now? If that was the 1990s, most of those therapies did dissipate, but they are on the rise again. And if not the whole therapy, certainly the parts of it that can be a problem. And they're often now like cloaked in new clothes, called something different. So for example, we know that EMDR, eye movement desensitization therapy, when used by itself can be very effective for PTSD. But there's a new form of it, which includes narration by a therapist, which is basically guided imagery. And it is unsurprising then that we're seeing lots of what we know are false memories, verifiably false memories coming out of this technique. So then that's the background and where we're at. What's the actual research here? Well, it took a while for Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues to actually develop a paradigm that they could use that would simulate some of what was thought was going on in therapy to determine whether or not people could develop a false memory. What they came up was with the false narrative paradigm, where participants had a sibling provide 4 memories, 3 full true memories, I should say, from their childhood, things that were known to have occurred. And then every participant was asked about one additional event that the sibling was able to verify did not happen. In this case, that was when they got lost in the mall, a shopping mall, and were rescued by a kind elderly lady. Here, participants were interviewed 3 times, and they were just asked to describe everything they could remember about each of the event. There wasn't really that much in the way of pressure here, but they were given guided imagery instructions. So they were told to close their eyes and imagine they were back at the mall. Where would it have been? What would it have been like? So certainly some degree of pressure, but not the same amount of pressure you would experience in a therapist's office. And what they found was that 25% of people came to remember getting lost in a shopping mall and took that memory and made it their own. So they provided additional personalized details about the event. Now, since that original demonstration, there have been a variety of false events used to demonstrate that people can come to remember things that didn't actually happen to them. For example, that they have spilt punch over the parents of the bride at a family wedding, that they've been rescued by a lifeguard, that they've had a serious indoor or outdoor accident, that they've received a rectal enema, and again, making sure that this actually hadn't happened, that they've been viciously attacked by a small animal, that they've witnessed a demonic possession, that they've had a non-existent medical procedure, in this case that a skin sample was cut off their index finger, and that they've been inappropriately licked by Pluto at Disneyland, noting that here that Pluto is not a Disney character. Okay, so just give me one moment while I have a sip of coffee. When we take these studies together, they did provide good evidence that it was possible to come to remember something that didn't happen, that had been verified as not having happened. But as a whole, the studies were rightly criticised because they used different coding methods and decision criteria to determine what was a false memory. So it was very difficult to collapse across those memories and get a good idea of what the real rate of false memories in any given population might be. It was also the case that different research groups, including my own, introduced middling categories that were not necessarily consistent across other categories. So we used images and no memories. Other groups had partial false memories. It was just very difficult to get a consistent picture of what was actually going on. That's where the mega-analysis comes in that I suggested as reading for this talk. Mega-analysis has an advantage over meta-analysis when you can't trust that the individual data points have all been coded the same way. So it was exactly what was needed in this case. So what we had, this group of researchers had 8 published adult false memory implantation studies, and the references are there on the slide for which ones were included, which collectively had 423 participants, so a much larger sample than you would ordinarily get for a implantation study. And what we did in this study was recode every single memory report for interview 1 and interview 3, because typically there was 3 interviews. So every one of these memory reports was coded for these particular criteria. And over time, each of the judges were trained until such a point that they got very high consistency ratings across different groups. So the key variables for the definition of a false memory became elaboration, acceptance, and imagery. And what happened here, as the system itself evolved was that in the end, what we were looking for was that each of these things were present, and that was coded yes or no. And obviously, if it wasn't present, you didn't go any further. But when it was present, it was then coded for the amount of that thing and the quality, from not present through to highly present on a 4-point scale. So these 3 variables become critical for the false memory definition. Now, each of the judge peers were trained on a set of unpublished studies. So we didn't want to use any of the published memory reports for training and then not be able to use them in the final analysis. So as we're working on the coding system, we worked on unpublished memory reports until such a time that the consistency ratings were high. And then we established 3 key false memory definitions, from partial through to robust. And I can tell you here that we must have gone back and forth for a full month about the naming of these things, and there's still argument between us about the naming of them. But nonetheless, this is what's in the paper. A partial false memory was defined as moderate acceptance, so about like halfway on the scale, along with any elaboration or imagery. So any information that went beyond what the person was provided with about the false event, and any description of images that they had in their mind of the false event. A full false memory was, again, moderate acceptance, so believing that it had in fact happened, but now with moderate elaboration and moderate imagery, so moving up the scale. Whereas a robust false memory was high acceptance, typically a statement that this definitely happened, I clearly remember, for example, as well as moderate elaboration and moderate imagery. So things that went beyond the description of the false event that they were provided with. And here is what we found for those 400 plus memory reports. Pie graphs can be difficult to note here, but the biggest slice here, 36%, over a full third of people did not develop a memory of the event. They had no memory at all of the event happening, but only 10% actively rejected it, said it did not happen. So the no memory reports just couldn't provide any detail about it, but they did not reject the possibility that the event had happened. You see 23% of people accepting the event, but not developing any kind of images or full memories of the event. Then we see 9% partial false memories, 11% full, and 11% robust, which when we collapse across them gives what we would call a 30.4% false memory rate, which is the rate that we would present, in the argument being that in any given population, we would expect 30% of people to develop a false memory under those conditions. Doing a mega-analysis also allowed us to look more closely at the particular strategies or techniques that increase the rate of false memories. And the most important one here was imagination, particularly guided imagery. So any instruction to imagine or any guided process of imagination increased the rate of false memories. Adding self-relevant information in the original report helped boost the rate, and providing a photograph, either a true photograph that really didn't depict the event, but maybe the people that were around at the time, or a doctored photograph, as the work of my lab did. You would see increased rates of false memories. When all 3 of those were present, guided imagery, self-relevant information, and a photograph, the rate of false memories was 46.1%. When none of those were present, it drops down to 26.3%. So you can see quite a difference based on the types of strategies that were being used. So that's when we come through to, it should be no surprise, I guess, that the rate of false memories increases when you include highly suggestive techniques such as hypnosis, group therapy, where everybody is discussing their experiences and encouraged to share, if not demanding sharing of their own experiences, interpreting dreams, a big no-no for suggestion. And as I noted before, EMDR when paired with a narrative or suggestive questioning by a therapist. These all increase the rate of false memories. So then what's the theory for how these false memories actually develop? Well, first there has to be a suggestion that can come from somewhere else, like a book or watching a movie, for example. It can be an active, overt suggestion from a therapist. It can also just be a belief that there must be an explanation for why the person feels the way they do. Then three things have to happen. The person has to find the event plausible, so that, like, personally plausible, that it could happen to them. They have to develop a belief that it did happen to them. And then they have to really construct a memory. So bring details in, usually from other memories. So these other details can be true, but they're combined in such a way that the end result is false. And after that, once they've done that, they need to have a source monitoring error. So they need to not recognize that the thing that they've come to imagine and build a memory of is only a construction of their imagination. When they fail that task and think that it actually happened, that's tantamount to a false memory. So I often am then questioned and under cross-examination on the witness stand about why it is that people could plausibly come to remember such horrific things happening to them. And my response to that is that we know people can and do this because they can also come to remember doing horrific things. We know through DNA testing via the Innocence Project that people can come to falsely confess to having committed horrific acts of violence. So it stands to reason that they could come to remember being the victim of that violence through similar suggestive techniques. Now, in my abstract, I promised that I would make a note of the kinds of questions that we still need answers to. And when applied to true memories of historical abuse, one question that I do think we need an answer to is whether there is actually something different about memories for sexual abuse compared to other memories that makes those memories more durable. Theoretically, there is no reason that there should be that I can discern, but we have no direct evidence to rebut this claim. And until we do, it will be a statement that is made in court a lot. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Deryn. Lovely talk.
Okay, I'm just trying to stop the share now. I just can't get it to.
Okay.
Maybe if someone has a short question for Deryn, but it has to be a short one, so you can just, you have to go, I don't remember how to raise the hand here, and reactions, I think. No, reactions is just to applause, so you have to go.
Yes. Nicolina was raising.
Okay, Lucia Alba, so.
We can start with Nicolina, if you mute. Or not. We cannot hear you.
She says she was just clapping.
Ah, or maybe. Yes, well, we go with Lucia then.
Hello, yes, I don't know if you can hear me properly. Yes, I had a short question. I don't know if this was taken into account or it was even investigated, but I wonder if there are certain personality traits that makes more prone to have these false memories, I'm not even thinking of personality disorders, which also may be some variable to account, but certain traits.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research into this particular question, whether or not it's people who are high images or low self-esteem, for example. Tons of researchers have tried to address this issue, and the upshot is that sometimes there will be correlations in the direction that support that idea, but they won't appear in another study. So on balance, we have to say that there is no evidence of one particular personality trait being more likely to develop false memories.
Okay.
Well, I think it's all. So one short question for Deryn also, talking about this kind of correlations. Is there any kind of correlation between people who in general are high in suggestion, in hypnosis, for example, with also the fact that they can create more false memories that are people who is not very susceptible of hypnosis and suggestion?
There's certainly support for that idea. There just hasn't been a huge amount of research into it to say with any definitive sense, but a good couple of studies have demonstrated that, yes.
Okay.
We have a question from Pablo. Ezequiel.
Oh, sorry, let me look in the chat, I can see.
Can you read, please, Fran?
Yeah, we can hear you. Okay. Have any studies been done to show whether by labelizing real memory, false memories are more likely to be generated?
No, I can't. No, we haven't done anything on that. That comes to mind. Sorry.
Okay. I have one question. If there's no other question, I was wondering if all the studies from inducing these false memories are of negative events.
There are ones that are positive events. I focus on the negative ones because usually the criticism is, well, of course you can implant a positive experience. That's got nothing to do with sexual abuse. So I certainly focused on the negative events, but there are positive ones as well. And arguably, it's easier to get a false memory for a positive event than it is for a negative event.
Well,
so I think we can move on.
Okay, I shall mute myself now.
Okay.
Thank you, Deryn.
Thank you very much, yes. And Katherine, if you want to discuss maybe later after your presentation, okay.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Okay, then. It's eerily silent out there. Unless you indicate otherwise, I'll assume you can hear me. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about credibility deficits, memory errors, and the criminal trial. So I think it's a similar sort of topic, but a definite change of direction from that last talk, although it'll be useful to refer back to it. So I'm interested in the credibility that's given to eyewitnesses and under what conditions eyewitnesses are given less credibility than they deserve. So my claim is that people are often given less credibility than they deserve as a result of a reasonable response by other people to evidence of their errors. I've made this point in previous work. I want to extend it here by arguing that this type of credibility deficit, this type of example where people are given less credibility that they deserve, is going to be particularly common amongst members of certain stigmatized and marginalized groups. So members of certain groups are especially likely to be given less credibility than they deserve in the ways I'm going to describe. There are a couple of implications. I won't go into these now, but I think there are a couple of important implications I'll mention towards the end. Okay, so the stages of the argument are as follows. There are ordinary memory errors that indicate the presence of cognitive capacities that facilitate being a good eyewitness. So there are errors that people make when they're giving testimony that might seem as if they indicate that someone's unreliable, but they can in fact indicate that they have these capacities that allow them to be good eyewitnesses. However, the same errors can be taken to indicate that this individual making the errors is unreliable, that they're untrustworthy, that they're cognitively incapable of providing good quality testimony. Therefore, I'm going to argue that there are these credibility deficits that can occur. I'm going to argue as well that these credibility deficits can be reasonable. Then I'm going to move on to focus on stigmatized and marginalized group members and show how they can be especially susceptible to these sorts of credibility deficits before highlighting the implications of this. Okay, so to get you started, I'm going to ask you to consider what is required to be a good eyewitness. And I'm going to give you an example. It's, you know, you can imagine other examples if you like, but I'm going to ask you to consider that you are stood by the side of a road, a car passes through a junction. There are, at the junction, there's either a sign or lights indicating whether they should stop or not. They continue through the junction and they crash into another vehicle. There's a fairly serious collision and there's a question about criminal responsibility. So what would be required of you in this situation to be a good eyewitness? Well, I think at least the following things are going to be important and required of you if you're going to be a good eyewitness. You're going to have to attend to relevant features of the event. So you're going to have to attend to relevant features of the collision and the behaviour of the vehicles before they are in the collision. So this, it seems to me, is going to involve an ability to predict the future. I mean, you might be lucky and you might happen to attend to the right features, but in very many cases, if you do attend to the right features of the collision, this is going to be because you've been able to predict what was going to happen. So perhaps you sensed from the corner of your eye that a car was traveling at quite a high speed, and this enabled you to predict that this car was likely to be involved in a crash. This would be one way that your ability to predict the future would enable you, facilitate you being a good eyewitness. Another way that it might be important for you to be able to predict the future is that you might be able to predict that it's important to attend to certain details, and you might, for example, note them down. So you might think, oh, was it, you know, I should pay attention here to whether or not the lights were working, you know, what color was the light, what color was the light likely to have been at the point where these the car passed through the lights and then collided. So it seems as if to be a good eyewitness, you need to be attending to the right features, and in order to do this well consistently, you're going to want to be able to predict the future. But you're not only going to want to be able to predict the future by basing your predictions wholly on events you've previously experienced that are exactly alike, because you're unlikely to have experienced exactly alike events. So it's likely that in the context of this sort of scenario where you're required to be an eyewitness, you're going to be predicting a novel event, so something that you've not experienced before. So given this, it seems as if that you also want to be able to draw on a capacity to predict events that are unlike things you've happened before. And this will require using your imagination and drawing on pieces of information about various different events that you've experienced in the past that are alike in some way to this particular event. So you might draw on previous experiences of driving through that junction. You might draw on previous experiences of seeing car crashes, either in your own life or in films or television. But you're going to, in making the prediction about what's going to happen, that's going to allow you to attend to the right details, you're going to draw on this ability to imagine the future and novel future events. So why is this important? Well, one reason I think this is important is because it seems like constructive memory systems and the capacities underlying our ability to remember the past are related in some way to these capacities that are required to be a good eyewitness. there's strong evidence that each of these capacities are supported by constructive human memory systems. Now, this is widely accepted now that human memory systems don't act like archives. They don't store complete and accurate records of past events. Instead, what happens when people remember the past is that they construct plausible representations of the past out of traces of information about the past events. So here you can see a process going on, which is much like that process that's required in order to make a prediction of the future that's going to allow you to be a good eyewitness. And you might think, well, that's fine. What you've got is a cognitive mechanism that's constructive, that underlies memory, and you want something similar to be going on when you're predicting the future in the situation of being an eyewitness. You want to be able to do the same sorts of things that are done through ordinary memory capacities. But you might think, well, as long as your prediction of the future isn't involving directly memory or not doing exactly the same thing, not representing the past, the two systems shouldn't be treated as the same, and you shouldn't think that the constructive memory system is going to be useful. But this idea is challenged by those views and the constructive memory systems that argue that the cognitive systems underpinning memory are responsible for both the recollection of the past and the prediction or projection of oneself into the future through imagination. And this is actually a fairly common view. So you find it in the mental time travel view, which says that constructive memory systems perform the function of allowing people to engage in mental time travel. So these constructive memory systems allow us to travel into the past and work out what happened in the past, but they also allow us to project ourselves into the future. Simulationism in philosophy argues something along a similar line. So for a simulationist, remembering simply is simulating or imagining, and it's simulating or imagining a representation of a past event. But the same sort of capacity could be used to imagine a future event. So you've got the same sorts of cognitive capacities underlying both representing the past and predicting the future. And similarly, Philip de Brigard defends a view according to which memory systems are just part of a broader capacity to simulate things that might have been the case. So if this is right, then those very same capacities required to remember the past are used to imagine hypothetical things that might have occurred in the present, but also in the future. So these same systems that are responsible for leading us to remember the past, these constructive memory systems, are also going to be those ones that are used by eyewitnesses to predict the future, to then attend to the right details and be good eyewitnesses. So what I've said so far hopefully gives you reason to think that the constructive nature of memory allows the prediction. Is the same systems responsible for memory. These constructive systems allow us to predict the future, or at least that there's good evidence in support of that claim. But more than this, researchers want to say that these constructive memories systems allow us to successfully predict the future. So they're not only allowing us to project ourselves into the future, they're allowing us to do so well. And they're allowing us to do so well because they allow us to flexibly recombine information from various different events. So if you're going to remember the past, then an event in the past, what you might do is try to remember going to the park to see a friend Mo, and in doing so you might end up constructing a recollection of that event, which involves various different details of different trips to the park, including some details about the trip with Mo, but also other details. And this might allow you to form a recollection of the past on the constructive memory view. But according to the constructive simulation hypothesis, this flexibility will also be what allows you to predict the future. So if you want to predict, for example, what it's going to be like to go to the park with Mo, you've not done it yet, then you can draw on various different experiences to do this novel thing, including experiences of going to the park with your friends. So what it's like at the park, whether there are good facilities, whether there's somewhere to sit and the rest. So the idea is that these constructive cognitive systems allow us to predict the future, and they allow us to do so well because they have this flexibility involved, allow the prediction of novel events. Okay, so the presence of constructive systems is said to facilitate the prediction of the future, including novel events, allowing people to flexibly draw on information about various past events to construct a representation of the future. Why is this important? Well, the crucial point in this section of the talk is that although constructive memory systems do these positive things, so they support the capacities required to be a good eyewitness, as we've just seen, hopefully you're convinced of at least, they also produce errors that can reasonably be taken to be evidence that someone is a bad eyewitness. So here I think a lot of this work has already been done by Deryn. So it's clear that when people claim that memory systems are constructive, and even that they can be usefully constructive, they're not saying that memory systems are perfect. In fact, a lot of the research that's motivated recent positivity around memory and constructive memory systems was actually stimulated by research focusing on distorted memories, the way that memories can be erroneous. So the suggestion that memory systems can't really work like archives because of the errors that they produce. And so there's plenty of evidence of this sort, suggesting that these constructive memory systems can produce errors. So I guess I don't really have to go into detail because of what we've already had about, for example, imagination inflation, the way that people can be encouraged to falsely remember certain events or details of events on the basis of being encouraged to imagine those events or those details. But you've also got literature on the misinformation effect, where people seem to mistakenly integrate false information provided by other people after the event. So their memories of an experience are then influenced by, coloured by what they're told by other people after the event. You can see that as being the result of the constructive nature of human memory systems. If human memory systems just worked like an archive, there wouldn't be room for this information provided after the event to be integrated into a representation of the past. At least it's difficult to imagine how that would happen. And just generally, when a person, including an eyewitness, attempts to remember something in the past, they can mistakenly integrate information about different events into their recollection and not recognize that they're doing this. So, for example, someone might have experienced like a similar sort of event, a similar sort of collision between two vehicles at a different point in time. When they try to remember this particular event, this particular collision, they integrate information from this other memory with their representation of this event, such that they misremember certain details, say the colour of the car, or quite how quickly the car that was ultimately responsible for the collision was travelling, or something like this. Okay, so constructive memory systems can be said to bring various advantages, but they also lead to errors. And so I think this gives us reason to think that eyewitnesses can make errors in their testimony due to the operation of constructive memory systems that support people being generally good eyewitnesses. So we've got these various capacities that are required to be a good eyewitness. These capacities seem to be supported by constructive cognitive systems, and yet these same systems can lead individuals to make errors. And it's important to note here that the misinformation effect, imagination inflation are common everyday errors, or at least there's some reason for thinking that they might be, and there is little reason to think that they're always pathological or the result of epistemic vice. So they're not necessarily the result of someone being lazy or irresponsible. Okay, so these can be ordinary errors. Obviously, they can lead to extreme cases like cases of abuse. You wouldn't want to say that that was an ordinary situation where someone is making a claim of abuse, but they can lead to small errors. So people misremembering details or thinking that certain things happened when they didn't. Okay, so if this is right, I think that people can make a reasonable response to people's errors in their testimony, a reasonable response, one that's driven by the evidence they have available to them, but can still be deeply problematic. So I think that if someone lacks knowledge about or awareness of the nature of ordinary errors, they can reasonably take errors made by other people to indicate that those other people are insincere or deceitful, or that they lack cognitive capacity, that they are unable to properly remember the past, that they're unable to retain information in such a way that allows them to provide high quality testimony. And where people are uninformed in this way, this could lead them to not only be critical of individual errors that are identified in someone's testimony. So if, for example, there's a lack of corroborating evidence, and in fact, evidence suggesting that details of a person's testimony are inaccurate, it can not only be those particular details that are dismissed and taken to be incorrect, but in fact, more broadly, the whole of the testimony that contains their errors. And I think that in this sort of case, it could be said that the broader testimony is dismissed unduly. So it's unduly dismissed, but it's unduly dismissed not clearly through anyone being unreasonable. So why should we think that it's likely that the whole of a person's testimony will be dismissed on the basis of small errors in the details of their testimony? Well, there's some evidence from mock trials suggesting that jurors will behave in this way. There's evidence suggesting that people are unwilling to convict on the basis of testimony that contains any errors. Where it's demonstrated that there's, for example, inconsistency in the testimony provided by an eyewitness, jurors can be unwilling to convict on the basis of that evidence. And they can be unwilling to convict on the basis of the evidence, even if the errors are in irrelevant details. So those irrelevant details don't touch upon the issues that are in the testimony that genuinely speak towards whether or not there's guilt or innocence. So I think there's evidence there, at least there's some evidence. Perhaps, there's always question about whether this same effect would be found in a naturalistic setting outside these particular scenarios. And perhaps this is something that you can speak to me about and inform me about, and that would be really helpful. But so I think that people are likely to make these sorts of responses, notice errors in detail, but assume that a person is more generally unreliable and that their testimony shouldn't be paid attention to. But it's not obviously unreasonable for them to do so. So it's not obviously unreasonable to you to notice an error and think someone is just generally unreliable, but it will lead to a credibility deficit, where a credibility deficit is a technical term that's been introduced or at least used in philosophy quite commonly recently, where a person gets less credibility than they deserve. So I want to introduce this idea that there can be reasonable credibility deficits in this sort of context, where eyewitnesses are given less credibility than they deserve. So they might say something that's really informative and helpful and could allow to a correct result or outcome in a trial, but they can be given less credibility than they deserve in giving that information due to reasonable responses by others, for example, jurors, to the ordinary errors that are found in the eyewitness testimony. These errors can be taken to indicate the presence of cognitive. These errors should be taken to be indicative of the presence of cognitive capacities that support being a good eyewitness, because they indicate that people have constructive memory systems, and these constructive memory systems actually aid in the prediction of the future and attention to the right sorts of details and so on. But the errors, rather than being taken in this way as indicating simply the presence of good capacities, they're taken, for example, by jurors to indicate a general unreliability, so that the whole of the testimony is dismissed or not given appropriate uptake. Right, so hopefully you're on board with that, or at least if you've got good reasons to not be on board, and you can tell me about them, and that'll be helpful. But now I want to move on, and I want to argue that members of certain stigmatized and marginalized groups are especially likely to be targets of these reasonable credibility deficits. In particular, I'm going to argue that due to how stereotypes about social identity tend to operate, it's likely that members of certain marginalized groups are likely to be given less credibility than they deserve, more likely than others. Okay, so I'm roughly here. Okay, so which are the relevant marginalized group members? Well, it's those people who are members of groups that are traditionally stereotyped in ways that are inconsistent with being a good eyewitness. So I'm thinking of people who are members of groups that are traditionally stereotyped as untrustworthy. Right, so depending on where you come from and the stereotypes endorsed in your society, this might be people like immigrants, asylum seekers, those with criminal records. And those who are stereotyped as members of groups that are associated with cognitive unreliability. So here, this might be older people or people with learning disabilities. So the idea is that people who are members of these sorts of groups with these sorts of stereotypes associated with them are more likely to suffer a credibility deficit due to how stereotypes ordinarily operate. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is some effects that stereotypes have on perception and judgment. I just want to do a little publicity that if you're interested in this, I've got a book coming out on this topic, which you can explore. It will be around at the end of the year. But the general idea is that where you have stereotypes in operation, they distort people's responses to information about individuals. And when it comes to the sorts of cases that I'm considering here, one relevant form of distortion that stereotypes lead to is that they lead people to tend to better notice and remember information that's consistent with a stereotype than information that's inconsistent or not associated at all with a stereotype. So one stereotype you might have that might lead to that effect is that the stereotype that a person, due to their social group membership, is unreliable. Now, actually, you find competing, I don't know if they're in competition really, but you find different sorts of effects here. You find effects where people are better able to remember information that's inconsistent with a stereotype under some conditions. But under the types of conditions that you find in a criminal trial, conditions where people are operating under a high cognitive load, where they have a large amount of information to process, or they have time constraints under which they're operating, people are particularly susceptible to being better able to notice and remember information that's inconsistent with a stereotype than other information. So what this means for the type of cases I'm talking about here is that where it's consistent with a stereotype that members of a certain group are unreliable, untrustworthy, or cognitively unreliable, their errors are especially likely to be noticed and remembered. So whereas with members of another group, perhaps a juror would have failed to notice the errors that an individual made who was part of that group, where someone is stereotyped as cognitively unreliable or untrustworthy, is especially likely their errors will be remembered, noticed, and therefore taken to undermine their testimony more broadly. On top of this, there's evidence suggesting that where information is ambiguous and a stereotype is in operation, the evidence is often interpreted as consistent with a stereotype rather than as it should be, as ambiguous. So in the types of cases I'm talking about here, you have evidence of errors in testimony, and this evidence is ambiguous. So it could reasonably be taken to be evidence that a person is generally untrustworthy or cognitively unreliable, or it could reasonably be taken to be evidence of an ordinary memory error that just is part of having a constructive memory system in the way it seems we all do. And therefore, it could be viewed as consistent with an eyewitness being generally reliable. But due to how stereotypes operate, for example, stereotypes about older people or immigrants, there's reason to think that when it comes to members of these sorts of groups, their errors are especially likely to be interpreted as evidence of their unreliability or untrustworthiness, rather than, as they should, all other things being equal, be interpreted as ambiguous. So here we find another reason to think that members of these groups are especially likely to suffer the credibility deficit, because it's especially likely that their errors will be interpreted as evidence of their unreliability due to this being fitting with the stereotype of them. And the final feature of stereotypes that I want to illustrate here is that behaviours can be explained in terms of the wider dispositions of a person when a stereotype is in operation. So what you might find is that you have an incident involving a black person and a white person, and if depending on which person engages in, say, an act of potential aggression, and depending on the stereotype associated with members of the particular group, it could be that their behaviour is either attributed to the situation of the individual or their wider dispositions. So if you have a stereotype associating black people, say with aggression and aggressiveness, then it's likely, according to this research, that you would explain behaviour, say ambiguous shoving behaviour, as in terms of the disposition of the black person towards aggression rather than the situation. Whereas if a white person did the same thing, a different explanation might be given, because there's this tendency for behaviours to be explained in terms of the wider dispositions of an individual when stereotyping occurs. Okay, what this suggests again is that ordinary errors might be attributed to the eyewitness being generally unreliable due to their group membership, so their age, their membership of a certain immigrant group, for example. And this might happen because this is what is fitting with the stereotype about their group. So ordinary errors which might otherwise be attributed in the case of other people, to features of a situation that they're in, or perhaps to general cognitive errors, the sorts of things we're generally susceptible to, could, in the case of an older person or a member of an immigrant group or another group that is deemed to be untrustworthy, to be associated with them being and explained in terms of them being generally untrustworthy. So then, members of certain marginalised groups are particularly susceptible, I would argue, to the credibility deficit that I'm discussing here. So information about their errors is especially likely to be noticed and remembered in comparison to other cases. Ambiguous errors are likely to be viewed as evidence of a general unreliability due to this fitting with existing stereotypes. Their errors are likely to be viewed as evidence of traits possessed by them, so something like a general untrustworthiness or cognitive unreliability. And this is likely to lead to the whole of their testimony being dismissed, even when it wouldn't have been in the cases of other eyewitnesses who aren't members of their social group. So here's an example. So we're to take that this person here, who is actually a stock photo from PowerPoint, is Dennis, who is a resident of a nursing home. So Dennis is quite astute. He's been paying attention to what's going on around him and has noticed a staff member going into residents' rooms when the residents are asleep for seemingly no good reason and coming out with more than they went in with. So Dennis watches this for a while, notices the pattern, eventually tells someone about this, and other evidence is gathered and a case is put forward to an appropriate setting. So testimony is given, and Dennis has testimony he can give, and he can give all sorts of useful information, but makes an error when providing the information and claims that this person was going into the rooms at a time when they couldn't have been because they weren't working, let's say. Makes some sort of ordinary error of this sort. And if Dennis hadn't been an older person living in a nursing home, had been someone from a member of a different social group, this testimony might have been taken on board. But as it stands, because of his membership of this group of older people, especially older people who are taken to be in such a situation that they're dependent on the sort of care required of being in a nursing home, it's assumed that the errors that he makes are indicative of a broader unreliability. So here we have a case where a stereotype interacts with this general tendency to give a credibility deficit to individuals, leading an individual to not be given the credit that they deserve and for their whole testimony to be dismissed. Now I just want to finish off with highlighting a couple of implications of this idea. So the first implication is really one for philosophers, right? So in philosophy, there's been a lot of attention to this notion of testimonial injustice. So various authors have argued that testimonial injustice is a serious phenomenon. Miranda Frick has got lots of attention in doing so. She's written a book in 2007, which has been highly influential. A testimonial injustice occurs where someone suffers a credibility deficit, very similar to the type of deficit that I've been talking about here. They're given less credibility than they deserve when they give testimony. But in Fricker's cases, the credibility deficit occurs due to prejudice, where prejudice is defined as an epistemically culpable resistance to evidence. So someone is prejudiced, and the prejudice influences their judgment when they hold a stereotype. They hold that stereotype in a way that means that they resist evidence that contradicts the stereotype. And on top of this, for prejudice to occur in Fricker's view, and therefore for testimonial injustice to occur, there has to be an effective investment on the part of the speaker. So the testimony of an individual must be dismissed or not given the credit it deserves due to the person hearing the testimony wanting in some way, having an effective investment in the person being discredited. So that's testimonial injustice as it's commonly discussed. I think what we find here in these reasonable credibility deficits is a phenomenon that's really similar. So someone given less credibility than they deserve, but something that can happen in the absence of prejudice. So it can occur as a reasonable response to the evidence, as I've said various times, and it can happen without someone being effectively invested in it. So you might imagine someone who's listening to Dennis's testimony while he's describing the actions of someone working in a residential home and thinking, oh my gosh, this person is despicable, like they're stealing from older people who are vulnerable, and actually being effectively invested in trusting Dennis, wanting to take the testimony on board, but nonetheless finding in the errors that he makes reason not to accept the testimony. So here I think you have an example where there isn't prejudice leading to a credibility deficit. And I think that this could be relatively common because of the way that stereotypes can interact with credibility deficits that are reasonable in the way I've described. But you might think, well, if there's no prejudice here, then we shouldn't worry. So what's so pernicious about testimonial injustice is that you've got these prejudices that are deep-seated and that follow people around various different places in their life, their jobs, when they're trying to get homes, all sorts of different situations. And if there's no prejudice here, then we shouldn't worry so much. But it's important to note that these reasonable credibility deficits I'm talking about can be similarly harmful to the sorts of credibility deficits that Fricker talks about. They can undermine the epistemic agency of the speaker. So if we take Dennis again, he might just feel like actually his status as someone who can have knowledge and give knowledge, his status as an epistemic agent is just not what it was. That he's now no longer in a situation to be able to gather evidence and provide it to people. This might lead him to lose interest in his projects. He might no longer read in the same way. He might not take that adult education course he was planning to. He might not do other things that he would have otherwise done. But on top of this, there could be really significant practical harms that come about as a result of these credibility deficits, even though there's no prejudice. So in the case of Dennis, you've got a lack of justice. As long as his testimony would have been crucial and it's dismissed, there can be a lack of justice. But you've also can imagine cases, for example, where someone is a victim of domestic abuse and then testimony isn't given the credibility it deserves. Again, not because of any prejudice on the part of other people, but due to the types of effects I've been talking about, and they end up back in the situation that was so harmful to them to start off with in their domestic life. So these credibility deficits can be significantly harmful. So I think this brings us to the second implication, which is that it seems to be important that actions should be taken to protect against these sorts of credibility deficits. So to reduce the sorts of epistemic and practical harms that I've been describing, but also many others that I haven't explored yet, decision makers should be armed with knowledge about this effect and how to tackle it. And I think this is especially important because of the reasonableness of the responses. It'd be very easy to see a juror who responds to Dennis's case by dismissing his testimony and similar sorts of cases as just doing the right thing. There's evidence there in support of their response. They're doing the reasonable thing. There's no reason to criticize it. But in fact, given that their response and similar responses can be so harmful and really not supported overall by the evidence once you understand how memory works, it seems like they should be challenged. Okay, so conclusions. Eyewitnesses often, we can talk about how often it occurs, but they make errors as a result of the ordinary operation of constructive memory systems. These errors can reasonably, yet falsely, be taken to provide evidence of a general unreliability, leading to the dismissal of all of a person's testimony on the basis of a few errors that they make. And in fact, this can occur where the errors are actually an indication of memory systems that facilitate being a good eyewitness. What happens in these sorts of cases is what I'm calling a reasonable credibility deficit. Someone is given less credibility than they deserve due to other people's responses to evidence of their errors. So it's an evidence-based judgment. Members of already marginalized groups are especially likely to suffer the credibility deficit. Their errors are especially likely to be noticed, remembered, interpreted as establishing general unreliability, and viewed as representative of broader dispositions to unreliability. When this occurs, what you have is a credibility deficit that happens due to stereotyping. So for those of you familiar with the testimonial injustice literature here, you should think, yeah, that's incredibly similar to the sorts of standard cases of testimonial injustice. But unlike testimonial injustice, this sort of case doesn't involve prejudice. But although it doesn't involve prejudice, it still can bring significant harm. So I would argue it's important to note that there can be credibility deficits that are similarly harmful to testimonial injustice, but occur in the absence of prejudice as reasonable responses to errors. And it can be important to ensure that the reasonableness of the errors doesn't mean that they're missed. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Katherine. So maybe there are some people who want to ask short questions to Katherine. It seems Mariela, she has a question. So Mariela, if you want to...
Yes, thank you very much. I want to make two small teeny questions. First one, why to choose this intellectualized notion of a good witness? Because it seems to me that it's something to be a good, being a good witness will be being a good conceptual thinker, because you have to use imagination, prediction, attention, all capacities that are managed with conceptual resources. So, and maybe errors will be something that happens with a more deflationated notion of witnesses. What my question was, why to choose this intellectualized conceptual notion about witnesses? And the other question was, it's related to to the Wolfram hypothesis. To confess, my honest opinion, I'm with you. But what about a situation where you add or admit some Wolfram hypothesis, and in that case, for example, imagination, prediction, attention, all these conceptual capacities necessary for being witness depends on language, the kind of language you're using. For in that case, errors will be related with the language in which your thoughts are shaped, and not on this kind of the group of membership, the membership of a group where you are. What about, because I think you are thinking in a universal constructive memory system, but what about if Wolf enters there? Thank you very much.
Okay. So the intellectualized notion of the eyewitness. So I suppose I did kind of precisely what I did in the talk, in that I thought through what's likely to be required. And it just seemed plausible to me that these sorts of capacities are required, that you couldn't really be a good eyewitness if you couldn't properly predict the future, if you didn't have the conceptual resources to do so. And so if you can provide an example that would convince me otherwise, that a good eyewitness could exist in the absence of those capacities, then that would be interesting to me, but it's difficult for me to conceive of that right now. It just seems to me that, yeah, in the absence of the ability to predict novel events, you just wouldn't be able to track the events in your environment. You wouldn't be able to work out what's likely to be relevant. You wouldn't be likely to pass on relevant information or jot it down or do the necessary things to be a good quality eyewitness. And they don't have to be things that are necessarily done just in the moment. As I've described that example, you could say, well, you know, things are going to happen really quickly, and in such a quick situation, you're not really engaged in slow, effortful thinking. But there's going to be a broader process involved in being a good eyewitness. And I think those sorts of capacities I've identified could come in various different stages in that process. I'm not exactly sure that I fully got your second question. So I agree that in order to be a good eyewitness, you're going to need language capacity. So I'm not saying that the capacities that I've focused on are the only capacities that are going to be required. In addition to this, you might need, you are going to need a linguistic capacity unless you've got some very specific scenario set up. And it could well be that members of certain groups are less likely to have that linguistic capacity. So if you're a member of an immigrant group, or if you're an asylum seeker, perhaps you won't have the language that is required to make yourself heard in the same way others might be. And that can be a source of injustice that can lead your testimony not to be given credit. That's simply just not something I'm exploring here. I'm going to look at it a bit in other work. I'm going to be looking at asylum seekers in particular, and the way that their testimony can be given less credibility for various different systemic reasons and due to prejudice. But that's just not simply something I've looked at right here.
There is a question in the chat, and I think Matthias Bonisha, he raised his hand, so I don't know. The other question was made that Lynn. Maybe Lynn, you want to read your question, or do you prefer that we read it for you?
Yeah, thank you so much for the exciting talk. I'm very interested in this topic. So here's my questions. So when you use the phrase reasonable credibility deficits, you seem to mean that these deficits are actually in some sense justified, supported by good reasons. But when these deficits are actually driven or exacerbated by negative stereotypes, in the cases of people of marginalized groups, when the hearers listen to the testimony, they wrongly attribute the traits of unreliability and untrustworthiness to these people who actually just commit what you regard as ordinary memory errors. And in these cases, it's difficult for me to see how these deficits are actually prejudice-free.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a lovely question. And this is why I focus in on the example of the older person, because there's some reason to think there that an older person is less likely to be as good at remembering as other people. Or at least it's fairly easy to imagine someone making that generalization based on the evidence that they've experienced. So part of my broader account of stereotypes is that stereotypes can be accurate in that way, but be really problematically distorting. So it's true that once I really focus in on the reasonable cases, there are probably going to be fewer of them than I'd like. On the other hand, I suppose I would like to use reasonable fairly loosely. So I don't mean reasonable in that they've considered all of the evidence, that they've considered the potential counterexamples to their stereotypes and the like. But it's reasonable in the sense that there is some evidence there that other people could take to be good quality evidence that could, for that reason, go under the radar and not be detected as a credibility deficit. So there's sort of two sorts of prongs to my response. First of all, you're right. I don't want to suggest that where people have stereotypes about immigrants or asylum seekers, that they're in any way justified in having those stereotypes, or that it's reasonable for them to have them. And so when I focus on the cases which truly could be viewed as reasonable, they're going to be fewer than perhaps I'm suggesting here. But second of all, I do want to say that being reasonable doesn't require that much on this particular conception of reasonableness. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Matthias?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if my mic is on. I think yes. Okay. Well, thank you for the talk. I think it's super interesting about the thing you said about marginalized people and the prejudices they carry on the daily basis. My question was about if those groups that are marginalized or put apart of society ability to speak up in any situation they can lead to any cognitive deficits. If there is any work that can say that these people, there are a group of marginalized groups, like, I don't know, that you say older people or people of color, etc., can have at a long term any deficit, cognitive deficit that can, I don't know if the word is undermine, or it can like, for example, if these people, when they give it, I don't know, any eyewitness testimony, if they are eyewitness of, I don't know, any violent scene, if their testimony, it can have any deficit, a cognitive deficit. I don't know if my question is, if you can understand my question, sorry.
So you mean whether it's likely that members of marginalized groups are likely to display more errors, perhaps? Is it something like that?
Yes, it's, yeah. If because of they have been marginalized all along of all their lives, they can end up having certain deficit, cognitive deficits. If I don't know if there's any works about that.
So I mean, what your question brings to mind for me is the work on stereotype threat. So are you familiar with this?
No.
So the idea is that when people are required to engage in a cognitive task, if a stereotype relating to their social group that sort of negatively relates them to the cognitive task is activated, if they're aware of it, they can underperform in the task. At least this is what this paradigm suggests. There's some literature suggesting that, for example, if oh, there's an interesting effect, or I might not get this precisely right, but Asian girls, if the stereotype of them being Asian is emphasized to them, they perform better on a maths test than they do if the stereotype of them being a girl is activated, suggesting that the stereotype is affecting their performance. So you could have that sort of effect present. How robust those findings are, how likely that's going to occur in any individual case, I think is a question I'm not really equipped to answer right now. But, you know, even if there is that finding out there, it seems like that's something to be aware of. And again, you know, this is another example where someone might display an error, but it's not a reflection of their general unreliability. So this could be another source of the sort of credibility deficit I'm talking about. So rather than like sort of telling against my argument, it might provide reason to expand it out a little bit. So that's useful, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about maybe some treatments that can be done when I don't know, you're with a witness that is part of these marginalized groups, and you know that maybe their testimony could be biased or could be with some kind of stereotyped things that are he or she are carrying with them. So maybe, I don't know, the question arises about maybe treatments or things to have on account at the moment of having this testimony. Like, okay, maybe this is a crime, a violent crime that implicates, I don't know, women or etc. So my witness is just a woman that was part of a domestic violence situation. So maybe I should have in mind that this question should be done this way, or maybe I shouldn't be doing these questions that way. I don't know if just the question rises, maybe it could be a good thing to have in mind.
I guess there are separate questions about trying to avoid making people revisit their trauma or their trauma experiences. But I think that's a sort of separate issue to what I'm discussing.
Yeah.
Links.
Okay,
sorry,
Deryn,
if you want to also answer the questions, so we open the questions for Katherine and Deryn at the same time, and then also if they want to discuss a little, but
sure, if I have anything I can contribute, I will jump in.
Okay, perfect.
Okay,
so now it's Saskia.
You can question, make your question. We cannot hear you. Again, please. No. Well, you can write it down, your question, at it.
Yes,
very softly. Or maybe Juan can ask.
As you want.
Yes, ask, Juan.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much for these interesting talks I have. Yeah, I was thinking to ask this question to Professor Puddifoot, but I think that this can be also, I would like to know what Professor Strange would like to say about this, but I have this kind of annoying philosophical question about the definitions of the concepts. So it's like, what do you have in mind when you talk about memory errors or false memories? Because how to put it? For example, in Professor Puddifoot's talk, when you proposed this kind of examples about memory errors, you propose this misinformation, the misinformation effect, the imagination inflation, and for example, in the contemporary philosophy of memory, the prototypical kind of memory errors are cases of confabulation or misremembering, typified by these cases of the DRM effect. And the misinformation effect, for example, and this other, the imagination inflation, are like relegated cases because these are more like source monitoring errors. I mean, meta-memory errors, in which the kind of the problem going on is kind of different from classical or traditional memory errors. And for example, yeah, no, that's the first part of the question. I have another one if we have time. Thanks.
Shall I start on this? So, so I actually had a similar question for Deryn. So I was interested in whether the memories that you're talking about, or at least the mental states that say that you're talking about, where they're like partially endorsed and they're like partially elaborated, whether these should be counted as memories. Because I'm inclined to be fairly liberal in my application of the term memory, and to say that you can have false and distorted memories, and you can have unreliably formed memories, and you can have memories that have all of these sort of negative features, and that if you don't adopt that approach, then you're going to end up in quite a skeptical position where you don't have very many memories. But then,
I completely agree.
Yeah. Okay.
And I would say that the thing about the definition is the participant claiming that they have a memory. That's the key point as to whether or not it's a memory. So when somebody says, I remember, then you have to assume that that memory that they have developed, that we call false, feels to them much like their other memories. It may be on a continuum, but they are calling this a memory. So therefore, it is a memory. But I kind of alluded to this in my talk, but I didn't spend much time on it. When people are constructing a false memory, a lot of it is going to be plausible, actual, true memories. So people, when they come to claim having been abused, for example, in childhood, they're not going to tell you it was somebody that they never met. So the person is a plausible person that they spent time with. The setting of the abuse is going to be a familiar setting. So you're going to get these really familiar aspects of the event that are drawn from true memories. So we see highly credible, highly detailed reports of the setting of the crime because those are true memories. So people can describe the wallpaper of their uncle's bedroom because they actually spent a lot of time in that bedroom for other reasons that were not at all abuse related. So these different components of the false memory might be true. The combination and the root event that they end up remembering, that's what's false. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think, but I think that it seems that the main component in your definition of memory errors or false memories is kind of a meta-level problem. Like it's more like it's not actually the content of the memory representation which is relevant to assess if something is a memory error or something else. So the problem is that in meta-memory errors are sometimes we have accurate memories, we have accurate contents with problems at the meta level. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you just like to combine both the object level and the meta level in order to define it, or just taking into account the meta level.
I think you have to take into account the meta level because that's at the point at which you're making the distinction. So you can have a false memory without actually claiming it as a memory. That's a non-believed memory. So you've got this picture in your head about something that has happened. You've imagined it. It's got lots and lots of detail, yet you still make the distinction that this is different and it didn't actually happen. You do that when you have a very clear dream and you wake up and you're like that's not real, or when you go through hypnosis and yet you still don't come out the other end having come to believe it. So you can't have I don't believe, I could be wrong, but I don't think you can have a memory error without having made that meta memory distinction. And indeed, in the theory, that source monitoring error is the final step.
Well, I'm going to read Saskia's question. Thanks, Juan, for the amazing question. Saskia says, thank you so much for the great talks. my question actually goes to both of you. What do you think about children and testimony? Because as I have it, their imagination and their sense to set themselves into the future is way better than ours. However, this usually comes with the trade-off that they mix reality and imagination more often than we do. And Ezequiel adds to that question, can children be considered a valuable population that is subject to less and unjust credibility?
I would certainly say that children can be unjustly maligned and that they are certainly capable of providing accurate testimony and that there are some great techniques to elicit their testimony. But it is also true that adults can introduce false information into children's reports. So if children are interviewed in an appropriate way, without any influence from the adult, then the product of their reports can often be better than that of an adult's.
That's really helpful for me because it does seem like another case. I think a lot of people would stereotype children as unreliable, but it seems like here it's not really them, it's the process around them that would be unreliable, so they could well be given less credibility than they deserve. And again, as a result of something that seems to be a generalization about them that could be reasonably held, I think. You wouldn't have to be unreasonable to think that children are less likely to give good quality testimony, and yet there seems to be something that's false.
Thank you. Arad, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Actually, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Oh, good. You kind of address it, but I'll ask anyway. First of all, but thank you for the interesting talks. I was wondering which characteristics of a group can be relevant when one estimates a testimony, let's say, can being treated in a suggestive psychotherapeutic treatment be relevant epistemically when you address credibility?
Yeah, so I think that there are various different things like this that are relevant, and I think that so this talk is building on another paper where I argue for the general credibility deficit, where people make these ordinary errors but they're taken to be something else. And in that paper I describe various things I think that should be considered when working out whether or not someone should be given less credibility, and that it's possible that jurors aren't considering. So whether or not they've been subjected to sorts of questioning, suggestive questioning, that's the word, would be one of those things. Other details about the situation in which they witnessed an event are going to be relevant too. So certainly there are features about an individual and their circumstances that are relevant, and I think that, yeah, whether or not suggestive questioning is a possibility in their case is one of those things. But I think actually you need more information rather than less, and in a way using stereotypes is always sort of a shortcut, which means that those sorts of pieces of information are likely to not be given the attention that they deserve.
So maybe now, Deryn and Katherine, I don't know if you want to interact between you and ask questions, if you have some comments, questions to do between you. So it's the moment.
I didn't actually think of too many questions while you were talking, and I apologize that I also ate something while you were talking and I forgot to turn my camera off, so apologies for you having to watch me eat. One thing that I did want to say is that I do think that there is a need for jurors to understand what are normal errors in the sense of what should normally be expected of a witness. And I didn't talk about this myself, but I have also testified in cases for historical claims of abuse where my testimony was really a yes, there are certain details that are missing. Yes, there are certain details that are confused. This is perfectly normal and to be expected because this is the way memory works. So I'm not always on the stand to say this memory is clearly should be considered to be not real, or trying to convince the jury that that's the angle that they should be taking. Oftentimes I'm also there saying, you know, errors are perfectly normal. In fact, when an absence of errors should be concerning, because this is the way memory works, particularly when we're talking about decades old memories. So I think that there is certainly a sense that we can educate juries both ways. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where experts aren't necessary in the courtroom, because I think that we do need to start from a level playing field, at least with everybody making decisions on the jury with the same set of facts in front of them. It would be nice to think that we might get a better public sense of the way memory works, but I am choosing to think that that probably won't happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, so I'm imagining sort of my work in a way being a case for people like you doing that sort of work, and just showing how the, you know, the philosophical relevance of that, how it fits into our conceptions of injustice, and particularly epistemic and testimonial injustice. So that's, yeah, that's good to hear that you're doing it. I had a question. So I was wondering what would count as good evidence of repression. So you say that there isn't good evidence. So I was wondering what would count as good evidence, because one thing I thought was that if you could find people who were claiming that they suddenly remembered things they didn't in the past, and they hadn't gone through therapy, then perhaps that might be good evidence in some way, of depending on the details. But then it seems like if you're adopting like a Freudian conception of repression, that's just simply not going to be repression.
Right,
so
exactly.
Is it like conceptually possible for there to be people who can provide good evidence of repression? What would that look like, I suppose?
Yeah, I don't think that there is in the Freudian sense of it, because you'd be, and this is what's one of the reasons why I thought that there was so many problems with all of the surveys that were conducted, because you're getting people claiming that there was a period in their life where they hadn't remembered the event that they now remember, but that's perfectly normal for forgetting. Like, the more you focus on an event, like for example, if you get together with your high school friends and somebody brings up something that you haven't thought about in ages, and everyone sparks off each other and they keep adding more details, suddenly you've got this really clear memory of an event that you hadn't thought about in ages. And if you're asked, was there a period of time where you had no memory of this event? You could very well say, yes, I had no memory of this until we talked about it. That doesn't mean you repressed it. It just means that you hadn't talked about it. So I'm really not sure if there could be good evidence. I know that the kinds of things that have been tried have been easily explained as something else. So it doesn't constitute evidence for the idea that you can take an event, hide it away in your mind somewhere, and then reactivate that memory in its whole form. And not have it be affected by the passage of time. That's really the critical piece. So I totally accept that you can not think about an event for decades. I don't accept that when you first think about that event, it can be untouched by time, that it will be like reliving it in that moment. I need some impressive evidence to be convinced otherwise, much like I do need impressive evidence that alien abduction is a real thing to accept it as real. It's not just the testimony that this has happened. I need to see something real to believe. And without that evidence, it's just a faith thing. And I don't have faith that memory works that way, because there's so much proof in other contexts that it doesn't.
I just wanted to ask you, Deryn, a question about what you were saying. This idea, for example, that some people maybe they didn't have the concept, the sexual abuse concept. I think it changed a lot during the last decades. And maybe 50 years ago, it was quite different from the way that we conceive it now. So the fact of having a different kind of concept and understanding that there are much more situations that can be considered as sexual harassment or sexual abuse. So they cannot, that kind of concept creating them, also make them remember now things that they didn't remember before because they didn't have the concept to understand their own experience. That is, so do you think something like that makes sense, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a real component of what's happening now. People going back and reevaluating their past memories in light of a new definition. So, and we see that can happen in really benign ways. So, for example, cases I've had where people now claiming that their grandparent who used to tickle them was actually abusing them. There's kind of no sense that it was perceived as sexual at the time. But now they think it could have been. So now they're remembering more in light of this frame. So the way they remember the event changes over time. So you can see the development in people's memory reports from, I used to really enjoy this activity. I would ask him to tickle me. Everybody would be there watching it. And the memory evolves to, it only ever happened in private and it was obviously sexual. So you can see changes in the way people think about events with new definitions happening over time, and certainly there's an element now with Me Too, for example, of people recognizing a wider swath of things can constitute abuse. I don't think that's inherently problematic, and that's probably a good thing. If the recognition is actually fitting with things that actually happened. It's only when people are trying to fit a narrative to a plausible scenario and reimagining what actually happened in that scenario that is potentially problematic.
I have a question, and then Juan can ask. Sorry, I leave you a minute. I was wondering, a moment ago, Deryn, you were saying the idea of the repression or a memory that you did not have access to maybe years later or years before actually retrieving that memory. And I believe that this changes depending on the theory of memory that you believe in. No? And I was wondering if you can, the idea of forgetting, if you actually can forget memories or you lose access to certain memories, and maybe if you could have the correct clues or keys to access certain memories, could lead to from another angle to a better testimony. For example, well, I'm being a mess with this question, but as I see the talk is centered on the falsability or the creation of false memories, but what we want are veridical testimony or correct testimony that reflects reality, and a few false memory components. So can we improve memory recollection, or are we just focusing on lowering the false memory rates? Is there something like that?
Yeah, I think it depends. Like I think that we can have very, very good memory testimony for recent events. Like there's very good evidence that people can remember very well recent events, even say within the last couple of years, that if the memory is protected and treated appropriately, so kept secure from suggestive influences, like I was saying about interviewing children. People can be very good witnesses, but when that memory hasn't been protected and has been the subject of decades of potential forgetting, that's a whole other kind of case, and that case type has to have a very particular approach to it. So that those memories should be treated in such a way that they perhaps have to reach a little bit more credibility than average, because of the fact that time could have done damage. And that there's a little in the way of corroboration available for those historical memories.
Juan, would you like to ask the question?
Yeah, thanks. I just have a follow-up question with respect to my previous question. I'm just wondering if, how to put it, taking into account that for both of you, the meta level of the memory process is the relevant level when it comes to define memory errors. I'm just wondering what do you think about cases, different kind of cases. So let's consider first cases in which the remembering subject is making a metamemory error. For example, he says that he's remembering something that he actually heard or imagined, but the content of his memory representation is totally accurate with respect to the past event. So these kind of cases in the philosophy of memory are called relearning cases, cases in which a subject experiences an event, and then he transmits a testimony about this event to a subject 2. But then for some, I don't know, an accident, the subject 1 develops retrograde amnesia and can't remember the event. But then subject 2 realizes that subject 1 cannot remember the experience. So subject 2 transmits again, I don't know, via testimony, what the experience was about. So subject 1 ends up having again the memory representation of the event, but given that he has a very unreliable memory system, he forgets having met subject 2, but he still remembers the information or the description of the first event. It's kind of a messy case, but in the literature of in the philosophy of memory, it can show us that he has a metamemory. He commits a metamemory error because he thinks that he's experienced something that he's remembering, something that he experienced, but actually he's remember subjects to testimony. So I'm just wondering if on your view, this kind of cases, tricky cases, are also instances of memory errors. And the last case that I would like to propose to introduce here is that, what do you think about cases in which a subject has a vivid and an accurate memory about an event that someone else experienced? So David Pilmer introduced this notion of vicarious memories,
right,
in which the subject in this case is not committing a metamemory error because he's aware that what he is or she is remembering.
Sorry, can you round up a little on the question?
Experience. So yeah, it's just that. What do you think about relearning and vicarious memories under your definition of memory errors? Sorry.
In both cases, I think that they are errors and that they count as memory errors. And to the extent that something like that ever would make it to a criminal or civil trial, I would hope that, my strong sense is that it wouldn't, that those kinds of cases just wouldn't be brought to, at least in the United States, because they wouldn't meet the threshold where prosecutors were willing to put somebody in that situation on the witness stand, or at least put their memories into a trial. But putting that aside, assuming that they actually did, I would then think that as long as the jury got all of the information about the situation and had enough information to make a judgment, then that's fine. Like they are a kind of error, and then it would be up to the jury to decide how much weight to put in that testimony, and that is always their job.
I think I'm not really committed to the view that is being attributed to me here. I would say that I would say that there'd be some appropriate causal connection required between the memory and the event, and that you're not going to find the appropriate causal connection in those sorts of cases. Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you just have time for a short question for both of you. For you, it's a question about educating the jurors and people working on the justice, or more a question of trying to translate all this, all the way in which our memory works in certain codes, or if there is other way that, because I have the impression that maybe it's putting too much responsibility on people working on the justice, to trying to be aware of how memory works, having knowledge about how memory works, and also at the same time being aware that they have certain kind of stereotypes that may be. So what do you think about that? What could be the measures, or at least if you have some ideas?
There's definitely a lot of pressure on people to understand the way memory works, or to recognize that they have a lack of knowledge and therefore need to reach out. But I don't know that there is an alternative, because I just can't see an alternative. So I guess that the more public information there is on the need for expert testimony, the safer position we will be in, or at least the hope that the more we can educate lawyers, at least, even if it's just defense attorneys, what they need to be looking for, then we have at least a hope that what gets into the courtroom can be considered appropriately.
So I just like to end in agreement. Perhaps we need to just be demanding in this sort of case.
Well, maybe we are going to finish, because we already spent 2 hours talking, and thank you very much again, Deryn and Katherine. It was a wonderful session, I think, so thank you, both of you. And
thank you for the invitation.
And
thanks everyone for joining in.
Yes, and
a lot of people
for
here.
your interesting questions also that contribute to the richness of the discussion. So, Francisco, do you want to?
Yes, I have to thank the Society for Argentine Neuroscience, the Sociedad Argentina de Análisis Filosófico, sorry. My lab is Sony Memoria, and the Institute of Buenos Aires, Institute of Technology of Buenos Aires, for making this possible. And we will leave this talk on YouTube, so you can go there then. And well, thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you very much.